Hi, my name is Joy Axelson. I work with the online SBS, and in this lecture of 1 Peter, we're going to be looking at some BRI information. So we're going to be looking at the date, the author, where it was written from, and who are the original readers. So who is the author of 1 Peter? Some internal evidence we see from 1 Peter 1:1. It says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. In 1 Peter 1:12, it mentions through those who preached the good news to you. So that indicates that Peter was probably not the one who brought the gospel to this area of Asia Minor. 1 Peter 5:1 and chapter 2 verse 23 talks about Peter as an elder, and he was an eyewitness to the suffering of Jesus. 1 Peter 5 verse 12 and 13. The author knew Silvanus or Silas and Mark. Silvanus might have written or been a scribe for Peter in writing the letter, and perhaps even delivered this letter to these churches. Although Peter was called specifically to minister to the Jews, we see that in Galatians 2:8, he, like Paul, worked among the Gentiles. If you remember from Acts 10, he went to Cornelius' house after he got the vision of the unclean animals, and so he realized that God wanted the gospel to go to the Gentiles just as much as the Jews. So through this book and in 1 Peter, we can really see Paul's heart of accepting the Gentiles. So some external evidence for Peter's authorship. It was accepted early and widely by the early church. Many of the church fathers from the late to the 2nd century directly or indirectly quotes Peter as the author. Most scholars accept Peter as the author, but there are a few objections for his authorship that have risen, and so I just want to share a few of them. Number one, they say that the Greek is too good and too polished for an uneducated Galilean fisherman. They say that the letter sounds too much like Paul's writings. And thirdly, the description of persecution in 1 Peter, they say fits better persecutions that happen after Peter's death. Some possible answers for these questions. Peter, in the sense, was untrained in the rabbinical schools, but he still had a sense of education, even if he was a fisherman. Most Jews in Galilee were bilingual from birth. He would use Greek as a businessman, as a fisherman. The wording of 1 Peter 5:12 suggests that he may have used Silvanus as a scribe. Peter and John had contact over the years, and of course they would have shared a lot of the same gospel. The gospel's the same. Some internal evidence in 1 Peter talks about the type of persecutions that the original reader would have suffered. So let's look at this list. It's starting with 1 Peter 1:6. It talks about grieved by various trials. Chapter 2:12, saying that some are speaking against the original reader. Chapter 3 verse 9 describes them being reviled, which is talking about verbal abuse. Chapter 3 verse 14, that they're suffering for righteousness' sake. Chapter 3 verse 16, they're being abused and called to account for their hope. Chapter 4 verse 1, they are suffering in the flesh. Chapter 4 verse 12, a fiery ordeal to test them. Chapter 4 verse 14, they're being insulted for the name of Christ. Chapter 4 verse 3 and verse 4 and verse 19, that they're suffering because they don't participate in evil like they used to. So basically, Peter was saying there that they're not behaving in ungodly lifestyle like they did before they were Christians, and they're being persecuted because of that. Peter also says that these believers need to be subject to the government, even the emperor. He says it in 1 Peter 2, verse 13 through 17. So it seems like he wouldn't be that direct if it was an official empire-wide persecution. So it seems like the persecution that the original reader are going through is more localized. It's a more verbal abuse. And this would be very common in the first century. And when you look back in the book of Acts and how Paul on his missionary journeys and others that went around, how they experienced persecution in the different cities they went to by Jews and by Gentiles. So that's probably the type of persecution these Christians are experiencing. It's just localized. So where was 1 Peter written from? Well, we see from 1 Peter 5, verse 13, that it says, she who is at Babylon. So what does that mean? Is it Babylon? Well, it most likely doesn't mean the ancient city of Babylon located in Mesopotamia, because this ancient city during this time would be mostly in ruins and not many people lived there. There's no evidence of a Christian church there, and there's no evidence of either Paul or Peter going to visit there. Babylon was probably a code name for the city of Rome, just as Babylon in the Old Testament was a symbol of worldly power, evil, paganism, and opposition to God's people. So the city of Rome in the New Testament would have been to them. So by referring to Rome as Babylon, Peter is carrying the Old Testament imagery of God's chosen people of Israel to the church. So when was 1 Peter written? The internal evidence we have while Peter is in Rome with Silvanus and Mark, we see that in 1 Peter 5:13, persecutions going on. Some external evidence, it's reported that Peter was in Rome at the end of his life. Church tradition holds that Peter was killed upside down on a cross under the Rome of Nero sometime around 65 through 67 AD. As we said before, the persecution listed in this book was most likely started before Nero's persecution in the summer of 64 AD. So this book probably was written sometime around 63 or the beginning of 64 AD. So who was this book written to? Well, we see in 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 1 that it was written to the elect exiles of the dispersion. And the areas that are listed there are mostly listed in northern modern Turkey. This would have been a circular letter to the major churches in those areas, especially in the northern provinces of Asia Minor. So why did he call them the elect exiles of the dispersion? What did that mean? Well, dispersion was a term used by the Greek-speaking Jews to refer to the Jewish people who lived outside of Israel. Here it seems like Peter is using this term in a spiritual sense to refer to the believers who are scattered throughout the world and living away from their heavenly home. The church most likely would have been made up of a mix of Gentiles, Jews, but mostly Gentiles because of some of the references in the book. For example, in 1 Peter 4, Chapter 1, verse 14, it describes them as being formularly ignorant of God. In 1 Peter 1, verse 18, it says their futile ways of life inherited from their forefathers. In 1 Peter 2, verse 9 and 10, said, once you were not a people, but now God's people. And if it was talking about Jewish people, they would have been offended by that. So most likely referring to the Gentiles. You see a list of Gentile sins that the original readers were to no longer be involved in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3 through 4. These problems listed is more problems of morality and lifestyle that related to typical problems of the Gentiles. The Jewish people primarily had problems with legalism, not immorality. So the audience is most likely Gentile with some Jews, although Peter was called specifically to minister to Jews. We see through this letter and even through Acts 10 how he was associated and shared the gospel with Gentiles. Peter uses Jewish terms in this book to refer to both Jews and Gentiles, such as in 1 Peter 2:9, where he calls them a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession. These believers were called as God's people, who were temporarily living in this world. They were on their way to a heavenly home when Jesus comes back. So this new perspective, Peter's trying to give them a new perspective that would help them to understand the temporariness of this world so that they can endure their persecution and suffering and hardship. Thank you.